Kia ora, and welcome to this conversation with Professor Richard Jackson, who's the director at the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, where I'm a PhD candidate. Richard, welcome, and thank you for making the time to have this conversation with me.
Kia ora, and yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Happy to be with you.
I don't think that you need an introduction. You are renowned as a guitar player, but also somewhat known for your scholarship on terrorism, or maybe that's the other way around. But listen, I mean, the reason I wanted to talk with you, and I suppose those listening in long after we conclude this discussion will know your scholarship on the issue that I wanted to touch base on, which is specifically looking at 2 decades after the 9/11 attacks in the United States. And I think on that day or soon after, you posted to Twitter an op-ed that you had penned 2 decades ago, soon after the attacks had occurred. And I thought that would be a useful foundation, because I found that what you had noted in there, characteristically was prescient, if not prophetic, in light of what has happened and occurred this year and over the past couple of months with regards to the American withdrawal and all of what has been reported more widely in the media. But maybe on a slightly more informal note, I think that I certainly remember where I was with great clarity in Sri Lanka, witnessing those frames over terrestrial TV at the time, almost in real time over CNN, rebroadcast over the state broadcaster in Sri Lanka. And I suppose, Richard, can you remember where you were and what you were doing when you first heard the news?
Absolutely. So, this is seared into my memory. I was actually at the time working here at the University of Otago in the politics department as a teaching fellow. And it was the day after I'd applied for a permanent position, and I didn't get it. So I was very depressed. And then I woke up in the morning and I put on the news and I saw the initial images of 9/11. This was when the first plane hit and the building was burning. And then I came to work and went to the student union, and we kept watching. And then we saw the second plane hit, and then a bit later on we saw the buildings come down. I mean, I spent most of the day there with everyone else, in stunned silence, watching what was happening, realizing that this was such a huge kind of world-changing event that was probably going to happen. Because in many ways, it coincided with a book that I'd been reading at that moment by Paul Rogers, who's a professor of peace studies at Bradford University, who wrote a terrific book called Losing Control. And it's all about Western security approaches in the world, an approach that he calls lidism. In other words, trying to keep the lid on insecurity and prevent it from, leaking over into the first world. And in that book, he has this really kind of prophetic paragraph where he talks about the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, when these attackers detonated a truck bomb in the corner of one of the Twin Towers in the basement, in the hope that it would destabilize the building and cause one building to fall and knock the other one down. Anyway, it failed. Some people were killed and thousands hurt, but the building survived. But what he wrote was, if that had succeeded, he expected that the United States would probably have started bombing a Middle Eastern country and launched a major global war against terrorists that would have led to destabilization and militarization and so on. Now, he wrote that in 1996, and I read that, just a few days before 9/11, and it seemed really prescient, and it turned out to be exactly prescient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's chilling, revealing, but also is a segue into some of the questions that I had. In your own op-ed published in the Otago Daily Times, I think on the 2nd of November based on your own margin notes that you put up on Twitter. And I quote, you note that, I quote, "The US-led campaign against terrorism is ultimately going to fail," end quote. And you go on to note that the ongoing struggle is what is most important, not end-frame objectives, end quote. And that is obviously referring to Al-Qaeda at the time. Now, reading this today, in light of all that has happened just this year, it seems, blatantly obvious. But you were marking this 20 years ago. And I'll talk a bit more about the public sentiment based on Pew Research in the United States. But this was not mainstream opinion. And it has yet to come to pass. What compelled you? What drove you to write and articulate these, at the time, I would imagine, Richard, hugely, inconvenient truths?
Yes, well, I mean, when I wrote, because I wrote a series of articles, and it was based on my dismay at, if you like, the lost opportunity of 9/11, in the sense that the day after, and in fact, the week after, and perhaps 2 weeks after, the whole world was in sympathy with the United States.
Yep.
At that moment, the United States had probably as much kind of social capital as any power in history. They could have come out and said, look, we have to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's nothing else for it, and no one is going to tell us that we shouldn't do this. And I think they could have solved it right then. They could have come out and said, all right, international law is now going to be something actually enforceable, and people are going to pay attention to it, and we're not going to mess around anymore. Conflicts, the arms trade, so many things they could have done with the world sympathy that they had, and no one would have been able to really oppose them. But instead, they adopted a typical American approach. And if you read David Campbell's book, Writing Security, he goes right back to the early foundation of America, and the way in which they securitized and treated the Native Americans, the way in which they securitized and treated the early anarchists, the way in which they treated and securitized German populations during the 2 world wars, the Japanese population, and so on and so on and so on. That it's kind of built into their foreign policy DNA that they only have a big hammer, so that every problem becomes something that needs to be hammered, and so they were going to do that. And this was just a dismay to me, that instead of taking a more positive approach that would sort of build peace in the world and perhaps get to the roots of terrorism, they were just going to start this war and bomb the most impoverished country in the world at that moment. And so I wrote a series of articles, and interestingly, there were lots of letters to the editor and so on, saying, Jackson is just this ivory tower armchair know-it-all who has no real world experience, and it's ridiculous what he's saying. But what I was saying was based upon the fact that, I'd done a PhD in conflict resolution, and I had an understanding of the way conflicts escalate and what you need to resolve conflict. And I could tell, and I knew this was not going to resolve any conflicts, and it was probably going to escalate conflicts, and that in the end, it would be a failure. And I was proven right, very sadly. But in fact, I had no idea at that point how big a failure. And I think to me, that is the thing that remains the most saddening and shocking, is that the best estimates we have are that something like 1.4 million people who otherwise would be alive have died, not in terrorist attacks, but in the response to 9/11. The war on terror has killed infinitely more people than the terrorist itself.
But on that framing, I mean, the war on terror, the op-ed goes, as in some detail as to how absurd a construct linguistically, but also conceptually, politically, and even just in terms of counterterrorism response that framing is. So I won't go into that, but I wanted to quote a sentence that you may that you write, and I quote: "Over-reliance on technological solutions is something that you very heavily come down hard against, and that you also speak about new strategies around winning hearts and minds." Now, you in op-ed from memory, you speak about the billions of dollars then that had been spent globally by the United States around what constituted counterterrorism initiatives from the US government up until 9/11, not counting what happened afterwards. I mean, have you as a scholar quantified the continuation of what you said were this predominantly technocratic, technocentric, technological orientation to counterterrorism, to the complete detriment of winning hearts and minds? Have you quantified? Has anybody quantified it?
Yes, well, look, there's a really terrific web resource from Brown University called The Costs of War.
Yep.
And they have, over the past few years, kind of meticulously tried to quantify the financial and human and material costs of the war on terror. And they're up to about $5 or $6 trillion now. So these are unimaginable sums. And if these sums, well, let's say if even a fraction of these sums had gone into, enhancing development, democracy, human well-being, and so on, that undoubtedly would have reduced the amount of terrorism by a huger proportion than what's been done, because what's been done has actually increased the amount of terrorism. I mean, it's this approach that's been taken, throwing enough resources channeled through the military and security apparatus at terrorism. It does nothing. There's no proof that it actually works anywhere. And in fact, if you look at it in a correlation, since the launch of the war on terror, at the launch of the war on terror, there was one Al Qaeda group. Now there's probably a dozen. Right.
Which you mentioned actually, that it's going to splinter.
And then, if you look at the number of recorded terrorist attacks every year, even if you have question marks, as I do, over the kind of politics of recording those sorts of things, but even taking that for granted, the correlation between the war on terror and the increase in terrorism attacks is quite stark, So this is why the anthropologist from Spain, Joseba Zulaika, talks about the self-fulfilling prophecy of counterterrorism. And he's written articles and books about this. And I think he's absolutely right. Counterterrorism has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more counter-terrorists engage in this kind of response to terrorism, the more they actually create the problem that they then have to spend more money trying to resolve.
A vicious cycle almost.
Absolutely a vicious cycle. And it just, they bring into reality the thing that they're trying to respond to. And this is one of the tragedies, one of the Kafkaesque tragedies that we're currently in the war on terror.
Richard, in the op-ed you speak to, and I'm sure that you've also written much more about, and in continuation, till recent times, around the importance of international law, basically. 20 years ago, you were flagging that as a very important marker, or as a foundation, or as a framing, which of course didn't occur, and you were warning against the unilateral decisions and the definitions that governed the US response. Is it still an important, North Star that counterterrorism, warts and all, needs to aspire to and subscribe to?
Absolutely. Again, this is another one of those tremendous costs of the war on terror that we need to take into account. And also, it sort of plays into debates that we're currently having around, if you like, the decline of the global liberal order. I mean, people are talking about that. They're talking about the way in which particularly under Trump, but even continuing today with the end of the Afghan occupation and the failure there, that the global liberal order is in deep trouble, and it seems to be on the decline. We've got the rise of authoritarianism and populism, you know, conflict between China and Russia and Western countries, and so on and so forth. In many ways, part of the decline of this order came directly out of the war on terror, when the United States gave itself permission, because of terrorism and the way they rhetorically constructed it as a threat to civilization, as a modern day evil, which gave them the permission to say, well, actually, yeah, we no longer have to follow international law.
Yeah.
So we can engage in preemptive strikes, for example, against countries that might be harboring terrorists. Now, this idea of preemptive warfare totally undermines the established UN based rule about states can only go to war in defense. Self-defense is the only legitimate basis for war. Well, now there's a new legitimate basis for war, which is if you think someone is about to attack you, you can just go ahead and attack them using military force. We also saw the decline of laws, international law against torture. And so torture then is no longer a norm or a law that states have to abide by.
But also this new vocabulary, Richard, you know, this extraordinary rendition and, you know, this whole, I don't know, this cosmetic veneer given to the most heinous of things, actually torture, right? I mean,
absolutely,
this is the Rumsfeldian legacy.
That's right. And it's not just torture, but it's, as you say, extraordinary rendition, which is a euphemism for kidnap.
Exactly right.
But beyond that, there's also the whole undermining of the global legal order around assassination through drone strikes.
Yeah.
So, you know, it used to be that there was a sort of accepted norm in international society that, yeah, you don't send assassins to other countries to kill people. Assassinations are wrong. But now, as long as those assassins are machines rather than people, it's fine. Now, all of these things, the cumulative effect of this is to undermine much of the normative basis of international law. And it leads to what we are seeing today, which is, you know, a proliferation of countries using assassination, whether it's Russia, you know, poisoning people overseas, or Nigeria and Pakistan sending drones into different zones to kill people, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, so many other countries are now treating people in ways that the West tries to condemn, but can't really condemn because they've treated them in the same way. So the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs is, you know, no different at all to Guantanamo Bay and so on. So there's no moral authority left to condemn that. So the decline of the global liberal order and the rules-based order and international law is definitely a consequence of the US's unbridled pursuit of a global war against evil terrorists.
And I suppose it does occur to me, Richard, and it's parenthetical to this conversation, that we have a former US president who's a Nobel Peace Laureate, under whose time drone strikes increased unimaginably.
Absolutely.
So you have these ironies, I suppose, that we don't often talk about, or it is convenient to talk about, but, you know, it really underscores your point just made. Maybe to complicate political response, I want to go to Pew Research and look at some of the stuff that they came up by national polling, you know, just after the attacks occurred mid-September 2001, so 2 decades ago. And I'm cherry picking, in a sense, a longer article online, which is actually really interesting, but not without being faithful to the general thrust of what they put out. And so one of the things that really popped out to me was that 77%, Richard, of those polled mid-September wanted military action and I quote, even if it meant US armed forces might suffer thousands of casualties. And connected to that, the Pew also found that 49% said, I mean, this is really fascinating, said a large concern was that the Bush administration would not strike quickly enough against the terrorists. So it kind of speaks to the earlier point you made about, the political rhetoric, but here you find public sentiment in a vicious cycle with political rhetoric. So my question is, for a layperson like myself, there seems to be a bit of an inevitability to what occurred. Would anything or could anything differently have happened given these polling figures in the United States alone?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I think probably the answer is fairly pessimistic.
Yeah.
And this is where culture comes in, and political culture, and the power of discourse. And I mean, what comes to mind when you're giving those statistics is, I think his name is Richard Slotkin's book Gunfighter Nation, which is a kind of a cultural analysis of American politics.
Yep.
And the way in which the American frontier plays such a powerful metaphoric role in US political thinking and political culture. I was also reminded of the downing of the South Korean airline in 1983, and they did a similar poll then, where something like 83% of the American public thought that the United States should fire a nuclear missile at Russia in response. So, I mean, what's being tapped into here is, 150 or 200 years of American political culture, where just like in the Old West, if someone insults your honor, or someone tries to steal something from you or attacks you, it's an automatic response that in order to restore your honor and protect your property and so on, you have to respond with violent force. And so this is a kind of an impulse. Now, what that means is that politically, it does make it extremely difficult for politicians in the United States to do something different. However, as we know from the South Korean airline incident, they did not launch nuclear weapons because obviously they were more prudent than that. And there is also a place for leadership. And even when leadership leads to unpopularity, sometimes it has to be done. And my sort of feeling, and I think a number of other scholars, is that if Al Gore had won the election instead of George Bush, there might have been a more measured response. I mean, there probably would have been some kind of military strikes, but it might have been more along the lines of what Clinton did after the embassy bombings in East Africa, when he bombed Afghanistan trying to kill bin Laden. He missed him. I think he also bombed Sudan, a factory there. But it was a very limited military option. It didn't involve a major invasion, and it certainly didn't involve trillions of dollars and two major wars and multitude, a global kind of thing. And there might have been more multilateral diplomacy to try and extradite bin Laden and deal with Al-Qaeda members around the world, strengthen international law and so on. I think he was much more multilateralist and perhaps but on the other hand, people might argue that, as a Democrat, they often feel ultra sensitive about being seen to be soft in compared to the Republicans. So they often overreact even more. And that's partly what we saw from Obama when, he called for withdrawal from Iraq. But, he basically said, don't worry, I am still going to kill a lot of people. I'm just going to do it by drones in a safer way.
Plus, of course, Guantanamo remains, right?
And absolutely, Guantanamo remained, even though he wanted to close that, unable to do so. But a lot of this speaks to the way in which discourse, and including popular culture, and I mean, one of my interests over the years has been movies and literature about terrorism and the way it constructs common sense about what we know. So then that structures the way we think of responding. And I think we see that all over the world, including here in New Zealand, where every time there's a terrorist incident, you know, the impulse is a kind of a harsh one, because we've been programmed through all the television shows we've seen to think that terrorists are not really human beings. They're evil, they're demonic in some way, and they're subhuman. And who cares about their human rights, because they've gone down a path which just puts them outside of the human community. And every terrorist you've ever seen depicted on television or in movies or read about in a novel has been this kind of inhuman caricature. And that, I see that as being one of the roots of the torture culture that emerged after 9/11, but also our ability to drone strike thousands of people without any sort of regret, not to mention the wars, and not to mention all the torture and the, you know, no-fly lists and the persecution of whole entire communities of people.
Which is, of course, asymmetrical. I mean, again, parenthetical, because we can keep talking about this, but, you know, Pew and, you know, such a volume of undeniable evidence suggests that within the United States and also globally, you know, this is asymmetrical, right? It impacts people of color, immigrants, refugees, you know,
absolutely,
the Muslims in particular, far, far more as embodied realities they have to negotiate, cannot but escape negotiating, and are often extremely violent, as in everyday violence as well.
Yes, I think one of the things we've learned since the start of the war on terror, and it's become clearer in more recent years, is that the war on terror became sort of, I suppose, grafted onto the existing forms of institutional racism and coloniality that we already had in place. And people have written very, very sort of insightful and penetrating analyses of the way in which the war on terror sort of mimics and reflects colonial policing, for example, in Africa, in the United States. So there's a terrific book comparing the way in which Native people were treated during the wars against them in the 17 and 1800s, and the way in which Muslims and people are treated, you know, including the way they're treated at Guantanamo Bay. There's terrific books on the way in which the war on terror, the way it's being prosecuted in Africa, follows very closely the way in which the British and the French and so on treated rebellious groups during the high colonial period. And now there's a whole body of literature analyzing the way in which Middle East interventions and Middle East security actions with drones and rendition and preventive detention and all kinds of things very much mimics the way in which the colonial powers ruled the Middle East back when. So, you know, it's as if nothing has changed over several hundred years of Western imperial behavior. And the war on terror kind of gave the excuse, if you like, and the legitimation to bring these kind of practices back and bring them out into the open and just pursue them under the guise that this is necessary because there's a war on civilization, because we're saving the world from savages. You know, even the language is there. If you analyze the language that Bush used in the lead up to the Abu Ghraib scandal.
And the savage is me.
Absolutely. Yes, you know, absolutely.
So
you're the embodiment of that. And you represent that entire group. And so, you know, interestingly, in the United States, some of the first people attacked after 9/11 because they thought they were representatives of the terrorists were Sikhs.
For Sikhs, I know.
Now we see this dynamic is not, you know, limited to that. In the United Kingdom, there were cases where Scottish people were shot by the police because they thought they were Irish terrorists. So again, there's always this kind of othering that takes place. And it's an othering that sort of relies on cultural stereotypes that are easily to misinterpret. and they're based on, you know, external markers. And then they become securitized. And again, yeah, just to say that this has been another one of the horrendous costs of the war on terror. The social costs, you know, the breakdown in social cohesion, the undermining of national unity, and the rise of Islamophobia, and what the literature calls the suspect community. Communities that are suspicious by nature, because that's where the terrorists are thought to come from.
Richard, you know, one of the things that has changed, I suppose, from when you wrote that op-ed and that early work responding to 9/11 and the extraordinary scenes from January this year around Capitol Hill. But of course, there's a direction of travel, I suppose, that increasingly suggested, indicated, and with examples provided evidence around domestic terrorism. Right-wing extremist nationalism, very quickly migrating into violent terrorism as theater or performative or however we want to see it, which wasn't really something that, 20 years ago was immediately evident. So I guess the question to you, Richard, is, I mean, of the many questions that I can ask, how do you see, study, and understand the 1/6 terrorism of 21 with the 9/11 terrorism of 2001?
Well, look, I think there's no question at all that there's a direct line between those two events. In fact, there are probably many direct lines. One of the things is that, and this is, I helped to start a field called critical terrorism studies, and one of the things that we've been critiquing the whole time since 9/11 is the inordinate focus on so-called Islamic terrorism, and the way that was elevated to a sort of existential threat that the whole world faced, and because there were over 1 billion Muslims, I mean, you could assume that the threat was just everywhere, and that Muslims were, but all the research was just focused on that. Because the research has been so focused on that, we missed. Well, the community of terrorism scholars and security scholars out there, almost to a person, missed the rise or the re-rise of right-wing extremist or white nationalist or white supremacist, whatever you want to call it, terrorism that has occurred since then. So we're still a little bit behind, and we still need to try and understand this. But one of the ways in which I understand this is that the discourse of the war on terror was very much rooted in a civilizational language. So this was an attack on civilization, which is shorthand for white civilization, because, that is the long history of colonialism and imperialism, that the whites are civilized and we take the civilization to the rest of the world. So when George Bush says, these are savages who are threatening civilization itself, that's code for they're threatening white civilization. So white supremacists have always been there. And in the United States, we have to recognize that it's been a white supremacist state, and an openly white supremacist state for most of its history, for nearly 200 years. And then for the last sort of 40 years, they had emancipation and so on. And they're still dealing with the vestiges of the previous 180 years of open white supremacism. The war on terror and this language of civilizational conflict and so on, in the same way that it permits the security forces and the politicians to break international law, to engage in incredibly violent responses that kill a lot of innocent bystanders, and it's all justified because of the threat, also gives permission for the re-emergence, if you like, of openly white supremacist opinion and groups in the United States. And then this becomes embodied in leaders, the most notorious of which is Trump, who then gives even more permission. That's one line of the way in which this has happened, is that the way the war on terror was framed from the very beginning, it was always going to be a white supremacist enterprise in a way. And it's not surprising that the white supremacists come right out of it. And there are so many examples of this. You know, some of the really disgusting ones are like the weapons manufacturer who put sort of Bible verses in the serial numbers of the rifles that US Marines were using to kill Muslims in Iraq, etc., etc. There's another line here, which is, I think, more to do, comes out of my analysis as a peace researcher and a conflict resolution person. And that is that as so-called Islamic terrorists attacked Western capitals with different types of attacks, and then as that was narrated as, you know, these people just want to kill all of us, that created a reaction itself. So that white supremacists said, well, look, if they're going to come over here and bomb us, then we're going to go into their mosques and kill them, or we're going to, you know, attack their communities, or we're going to use terrorism as well. If they're going to use terrorism, we're going to use terrorism to try and provoke a race war that will once and for all clean them out of our societies and so on. So there's a kind of a violent response there. And I think there's also a kind of second line there, which is that, well, look, if our government can go over there and torture people and bomb them, well, how can you say that if I go and do that, that's wrong? I mean, I'm just doing what our government's doing overseas. And again, it's the way in which political discourse and political behavior is not an isolated thing. It's not just something that leaders do, but it's constitutive. It helps to create further action, and it provokes more action. And I mean, one of the things that we've always sort of failed to do in our studies of terrorism is factor in the way in which terrorism and counterterrorism are actually one and the same, in a sense. They feed off each other. They're a single phenomenon. We don't need to separate terrorism and just treat it in isolation, but we can only understand terrorism when we realize that it's intimately tied to counterterrorism. And they feed off each other.
So that's an interesting segue maybe to my final set of questions, which is to bring it home to Aotearoa and look into the responses after the new Lynn Mall attack recently, at least recently to the time of recording this. And of the many questions that I can ask and of the many places and things that you've said and written, I was struck by how you ended your short op-ed, but very interesting op-ed to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, available online, where in that last para, Richard, you note, and I quote, while there is an understandable political impulse to be seen to be responding vigorously following a terrorist incident, the 20-year anniversary of the war on terror should give New Zealand government real pause to consider the potential costs, harms, and mistakes of knee-jerk reactions, responses to acts of terrorism. Do they really want to rush through legislation that will likely be ineffectual and which could lead to future human rights abuses? End quote. And you go on to note some of the recommendations of the Royal Commission of Inquiry on the Christchurch attack. Listen, I mean, there is the Christchurch, there is the report of the Commission of Inquiry, there is the Christchurch call, there are the 4 pillars of the counter-terrorism strategy, there are the 4 pillars of the Honourable Foreign Minister's domestic and foreign policy response. So, I mean, there's a lot that seems on principle and paper and notionally different in Aotearoa as a counter-terrorism response that has most recently come into the forefront as a consequence of the attacks in Auckland. What, you know, I don't want to lead you with a question, but what's your take on the response of the government to what happened recently in Auckland in light of everything that is, as I said, in principle and paper, and you know far more better than most, and certainly myself, there as a, a different discourse to what we just talked about coming out of the United States?
Yes, look, I would say that it's a bit of a mixed bag. In the sense that there's a lot in the Royal Commission report that's very I think measured and promising, and certainly there's a kind of an aim in that report to try and come up with a response that's based on evidence, that's recognizing the diverse community that New Zealand is, and that wants to try and tackle this in a positive way. So engage in measures that will build community cohesion, that will deal with genuine sources of grievance, and that will create a resilient society. If the government was to solely concentrate on that and work hard on that and put huge resources into that, I mean, this would be, I think, a shining example to the rest of the world. What concerns me is that at the same time, because we've had 20 years of war on terror where we've been told that terrorism is this huge threat, that it's terribly evil, and we now know that it's come to the shores of New Zealand after not being here for most of that period, so we're all frightened, there's still this impulse, like you mentioned in the United States, it's not as strong, but there's still this impulse to say, oh my God, something's happened, we have to respond, and it has to be security-based. How do we create instant security? And the impulse of the government, driven by this political pressure, is to say, oh, well, let's speed up those security measures that we were considering in the legislation, giving more powers to the security services, expanding the definition of terrorism, criminalizing more and more activities so that we can lock up more people and use the state's extraordinary powers to, deal with people who we consider to be a threat. I mean, that is the worrying part, is that those kinds of impulses and that kind of political pressure, which is the direct result of politicians kind of fear-mongering for 20 years, then becomes the primary way in which we respond to terrorism. And all the other measures, which would probably be more successful and certainly don't carry the risks of simply repeating all the mistakes that we've seen in other countries that end up oppressing certain communities and groups, it would be so much better. I mean, to me, the broader context here, which I don't see anyone really talking about, particularly at the political level, is that we've got 20 years of data, right? So we've had 20 years of a war on terror with many dozens of countries enacting all kinds of legislation, spending $5 trillion plus on programs. We've got the data to be able to analyze that and say, well, what really worked? But no one is doing that. And I'll tell you why, because almost none of it worked. It was almost all of it a waste. And as we've talked about in this podcast, you know, at the level of international law, at the level of community relations, at the level of human rights, at the level of opportunity costs because of the spending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we have made things worse. But we're kind of trapped. We're trapped in this rhetoric, this language, this set of beliefs and culture that terrorism is so evil, we've got to do anything we can to stop her. And yeah, so this is the dilemma we're in at the moment. And this is what worries me, is that New Zealand's kind of on a knife edge here. We could go down that kind of more authoritarian path where we try and deal in a security way, following what Britain, America, and Europe and other countries have done. Or we could take a different path and say, look, no, actually, we're going to look at the evidence, and we're also going to think about, why do people want to become terrorists? Shouldn't we be trying to stop that rather than what do we do once they've already pulled out a knife and started stabbing people? I mean, why not stop it much further down the track if we can. But that's a much more long-term complex issue to deal with than the quick knee-jerk reaction. Oh, there's a terrorist attack. Let's pass a raft of legislation. Let's give the police guns. Let's embolden the security services so they can come right into your house and plant a bug.
Plus surveillance. I mean, again, parenthetical and goes beyond our podcast. But something that I've always said is that what happens here in Aotearoa and say the Five Eyes or the OECD or the perceived Western states has a huge impact on the rest of the world, because that then becomes the excuse, as you can imagine, for authoritarianism and dictatorial regimes to say, hey, look, New Zealand did it, Australia did it, the UK did it, or the US did it, and it's fine for us to do it, because it kind of speaks to your earlier point.
Especially now, I think, because New Zealand, in a way, has become an opinion leader.
Absolutely.
Globally, Jacinda's reputation is so high, and so New Zealand is seen as this sort of paragon of virtue. I mean, living here, we know that's totally not true, but that's the perception. So I think if New Zealand does take these kinds of measures, it will have an impact on other countries.
And soft power is very important. I mean, again, that's a different conversation. But you're quite right. I mean, she and the country and Aotearoa can use it. Listen, Richard, we can talk about this for days on end. My final question is: listen, 20 years ago, you have explicitly said that you were seen as somebody who shouldn't be taken seriously for things that very sadly have come true. And how? In those 2 decades, and reflecting on those 2 decades, are people taking you, as in not you as an individual, but your critical terrorism and what you bring to the table any more seriously than they did 20 years ago? And I guess I know the answer to this, and to maybe leave on an optimistic and hopeful note, what more do you think can be done to strengthen what you bring to the table in terms of the perspective and the critical reflection of what hasn't worked for 2 decades now, if not longer?
Yeah, look, that's a really tricky question. I mean, it's a depressing question in a way, because
I know.
The truth of the matter is that very little has changed. Critical terrorism studies and critical scholars that I know have been, pointing out the obvious for so long. But not just that, marshalling the evidence as well. And all the evidence is there. No one who is serious about this can dive into the literature that exists and look at all the studies that have been published and come out concluding that the war on terror has had any really positive aspects to it, and that counterterrorism has been in any way a success. So what we have to recognize is that there are so many entrenched embedded interests that we're up against. I mean, one of the things that happened after 9/11 is huge budget increases for the security services, for sort of conservative think tanks and security think tanks. The security sector as a whole has made, trillions of dollars. I mean, the private security sector in the United States, $50 billion a year plus in all the contracts that they get from the government for counterterrorism related activities. It's a huge racket. The military, the spies, the police, the prison service. I mean, everybody makes money off this. Everybody has, increased sort of power and influence. So for us to turn around and say, look, well, everything that you've been doing isn't working. You need to stop. We could perhaps, take the budget from the security services and all the surveillance you're doing and put it into community development, and that would probably work better. I mean, the vested interests find this very hard to fathom. It also doesn't really work in the media. I had so many experiences in the early years where they thought I was a terrorism expert who was commentating. And when I said, look, I mean, you're much more likely to be killed in a car accident than by a terrorist, they're all scratching their heads saying, why have we got this guy on here? We want him to tell us about bombs and blood and the threat and you know. So no, they didn't invite me on anymore. You know, they invited on the people like, oh yeah, threat of nuclear terrorism, chemical weapons. They're going to release a biological agent. You know, we should all be afraid. So there's media interest. So the message that we have is very antithetical and countercultural and counterintuitive to the dominant paradigm, the dominant common sense. So it's very, very tricky. I should say that in small ways, I have colleagues and my own involvement in a group of scholars in New Zealand who are kind of working with the government on their idea to set up a national center for studying counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. I do feel like someone is starting to listen a little bit, but then I was dismayed when they, you know, decided, despite the submission that I made on the bill, they decided to rush through this latest counterterrorism legislation. So I mean, that tells me again that it's going to be an uphill struggle. Perhaps not to be heard, but to be actually listened to and taken notice of. And I think, you know, what this tells us is that when you're a critical scholar doing critiques of established institutional practices and institutions and interests and so on, it is an uphill struggle, and you have to try and use all the means that you have. And we should never downplay the importance of social media, engaging in the public sphere, engaging in popular culture. You know, I'd love to, once upon a time, I was involved in a project to perhaps do a documentary series for a mainstream television audience in the United Kingdom. It fell through at the last minute, but you know, we've got to get some documentaries out there. We've got to make movies. We've got to. I myself tried to write a novel about terrorism. There's so many things we need to do at a broader level to try and find a wedge into the dominant discourse, which will hopefully then start to have some impact.
Thank you, Richard. Listen, you're far too humble around your own sphere of influence. I can say it, and you are free to deny it, that I have, in the 3.5 years to 4 years I've spent at NCPACS, heard many students say that the reason they came to study peace and conflict resolution and transformation is you and the critical terrorism legacy that you have pioneered in how we can think differently to what the status quo would see as responses to terrorism. So I think that NCPACS and Otago are very, very lucky to have you. I certainly have benefited immensely from the pleasure of your company since I came here, and the quality of your insight and intellect. So thank you very much, Richard, for joining us and joining me actually on this podcast and sharing your thoughts.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for your kind words, and it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you as well. And this has been a wonderful discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Richard.